All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's open forum. A couple of opening announcements before we get into the slides. Helping me out today in the chat window is Captain Indy Blakely. She's showing up as Indigo, she's going to help me not miss things in the chat window today. I am trying to record this. It looks like the recording's working, so it'll be available to others that may want to take a look at it later on. If you're having any problems, go ahead and put it in the chat window and with connectivity, or if you can't hear me or can't see the slides or something, I'll try to call them out. I did send the slides out this morning with the Outlook calendar appointment, so you can find the slides there, hopefully, or they may be showing up here on Zoom. I chose to use Zoom today because you can come off mute in this kind of setting where you can't in CVR, to my knowledge, and you also have the ability to do an anonymous chat. So keep that in mind. I think you can do an anonymous chat. If someone wants to test that out while I'm doing this intro, that'd be good. But I wanted to provide that to you. Good. Okay. Thank you. So why this focus today? There's definitely more forms of unjust discrimination, unjust prejudice than racial, and I don't want to make light of other forms. Whether it's sexual discrimination, ageism, etc. Those are all weighty matters that deserve the same kind of treatment we're doing here today. But it was my decision to focus today on racial prejudice. I think our country, our nation is speaking very clearly right now that this matter of racial prejudice needs to be addressed. And I think my decision was, if I broadened it out to more categories of discrimination or prejudice, it would take away from what our nation is saying to focus on. So up front, I wanted you to hear me say that I recognize there are other forms of discrimination that also need to be addressed. And I wanted you to hear the reason why today I'm focusing on the racial prejudice. Also got Greg Brown on as a panelist, so he can help me too if I miss things, or on the chat window or other places, the Q&A box as well. All right, so I'm going to move on to the first slide here, just the overview. My intention is for this to be a conversation today. I do have a couple of times where I'm going to chime in, hopefully to generate some discussion. But first, let me set some of the rules of engagement, some of the ground rules for today. So as I mentioned, if I definitely want to hear from you today. To do so, I think you can raise your hand on Zoom Gov, and you can come off mute that way, or you can put a chat in the chat box. I see someone maybe having problems with your audio. How about, can someone let me know they can hear me all right, just to make sure I'm not broken up or too soft? Okay, all right, super, thank you. So that's the first rule of engagement. Just how to participate here is number one. Number two, let's all listen to understand. Three is key to me. We got to be teachable. And I believe that we all have blind spots, and I'll talk about some of my blind spots and my family's blind spots as we go along here. I think it's true for everybody. Number four, I put this in here this morning, and it's probably the most important one for me. This is going to be a flawed forum. I will not say things perfect. There will be things left unsaid that really ought to have been said. And more than likely, either I will say something that isn't quite right, or somebody else who chimes in may also miss the mark. So I think we need to accept that. We're just trying to have a very complicated and difficult topic discussed today. And we're going to have some flaws along the way, but we need to have the conversation. I'm sure we will show each other respect and listen without judging. I do ask you to resist the temptation. If you know of somebody else in the program office who has a story to tell, don't point them out here. It may not be the right moment, maybe too soon, maybe too uncomfortable for them. So don't put anybody else on the spot today is the last ground rule. Okay. So what I'm after today, this is the chart titled My Goal Today for those not able to see the screen. I want to tie this topic into our mission as airmen. So hopefully that'll come through the message as I get into some of the charts here, is how this relates to us and how it becomes a warfighting factor for us, being able to be diverse, to be inclusive. A main goal for me is to listen to the comments that come in and to draw out experiences. Now, I've heard at least one already of recent, what to me sounds like clear racial prejudice in our workplace. I'm really looking to ask a couple of questions with the intention of drawing out what else may be going on in our workplace. I'm interested in anything that comes to mind in that area, whether it is hiring or promotions or day-to-day, work life or TDY behaviors. I will tell you that when it comes to hiring and promotion, I will be your advocate. I admit I don't have a lot of control over hiring decisions or even the promotion process, but I can certainly be your advocate on your behalf. I have more control over our workplace, over day-to-day activities and practices and things that are said, how you're treated, what happens on the road when you're TDY. That I have much more immediate control over, but I'm interested in any of it. I spent a good bit of time going back over the last couple of years' climate surveys, the DEOCs that we typically do once a year. And what I found is there's very little in that survey that deals with race. There's basically two questions. So here you've got a long survey, and it only has two questions that deal with race, one very general and one specific. I think we can do better. And I'm asking for your help to come up with some better questions. I realize that not everybody is willing on an open forum to speak up. Even the chat they may be uncomfortable with. So I do want to send out a division-wide survey for those that that's a more comfortable way for them to participate. So help me today with some questions for that survey that get at this area of racial prejudice. And then how do we keep this going? That's a key question on everybody's mind. Will this be just the crisis of the day? And then when tomorrow's crisis, whatever it may be, pops up, we'll have to shift our focus to that. That's not my intent. I recognize that it's a difficult thing to sustain a focus on a topic, given all the crises that we deal with. So help me find a way to institutionalize this in our workplace. Okay, so those are some goals that I have for today. I'm going to ask you to share your story, open it up for folks that are willing to do that. I thought maybe it'd be easier if I talked about mine for just a couple of minutes. So I was born in New England, but my dad, when he retired from the Army, he was a senior enlisted member in the Army. He moved back to his home state, which is upstate South Carolina. And I spent most of my childhood from roughly 1975 in the Southeast, either up there in South Carolina, the upstate part, or I went to school at Auburn in Alabama. So most of my childhood was spent there in the Southeast. Didn't do a lot of traveling. I didn't get out and see the world or anything. So I grew up in the South in the 70s and 80s. I can remember our little town called Seneca, South Carolina, near Clemson. I remember on more than one occasion at a stoplight in this little southern town. I'm in the passenger seat with my mom. She's driving. And I can remember KKK folks coming up to the car, handing out, a tract or some kind of pamphlet. Very small town. We lived on a small farm. I'm not going to dishonor my parents, but they were products of their culture. My dad grew up from a very poor family in South Carolina. My mother grew up in Florida. Things said in private in my house, in our family as a kid, occasionally were certainly racist. I won't get more particular than that, but there were things said and thought and expressed when I was a kid that I heard from my parents that were wrong. And I hope that if my dad was alive today, or I think that they would admit that and agree with that as well. I met my wife at college, and my wife, she's been a diabetic since she was 3. This is a picture of her back in 2007. She grew up as a diabetic. She was 1 since she was 3. She thought she couldn't have any biological children. And so from the time she was a young girl, she wanted to have kids, and assumed she would have to adopt to have children. I think in God's kindness, he gave us 3 biological children, which were great surprises to us. And one of them is missing in the picture here. One of my biological kids is missing. I'm not sure what he was doing that day. But this is a picture from a courtroom around Birmingham, Alabama. And that's a great day for our family. That was adoption number 2. That's little EJ. And 2 years before that, we had adopted Faith in 2005. Both as infants, both children were born in really difficult circumstances, very broken situations there in Alabama. Matter of fact, if Scott Hall is on, or any Bama fans are on, EJ was born in Tuscaloosa. So here you have an Auburn family taking one away from Tuscaloosa. But a quick short version of our adoption story that ties into our topic today. My wife has always been the gas pedal, and I've been the brake when it comes to family size. And on her 3rd biological birth, the doctor said, you absolutely cannot have any more. She's always wanted to have, a larger family. And so that's when we went back to looking at adoption. Something that had been in her heart for decades. We got through the home study process that you do with adoption, with the social workers, screened, all those kinds of steps. And we learned something important that ties in here. And by no means, am I trying to disparage anybody who's adopting. But for us, the reality back in 2005 and 2007 was, if you wanted to adopt a child of our race that's healthy, it's about a 2-year wait. But nobody is in line at all for a healthy child that's African American. And that just broke our heart to think about that. Sorry. So our adoptions went very smoothly back in 2005 and 2007. And if you're a parent out there, you probably heard the debate about, nature versus nurture. And, I'll tell you, parenting outside of your gene pool, so to speak, has some challenges. So I think there's something to the nature part. My wife and I are about as white as you can get. We're both engineers, a lot of limitations. And there's been some real differences, obviously, expanding our family to be an interracial family. But I believe it's made us more diverse, and in that, better experiences, better understanding of our world, of the different cultures of our world. Through the years, there's been the occasional either awkward or offensive remark, but nothing terrible. So by no means am I trying to say I understand what it's like to grow up as an African-American boy in the South. I can't say that, but I have a little taste, a little appreciation. We've had the talks with my son. This is a recent picture from last year here when we were here at Utah. We've had some talks with my son. He had a tendency of, in Georgia, where we were last stationed at, he had a tendency of walking through people's backyards in our neighborhood. And we talked to him about why he just couldn't do that, why it was not a wise thing to do, to run through people's backyards that he doesn't really know. I think we'll have other talks. As Faith here, she turns 15 in a couple of months, and she'll begin driving. And I think with EJ, he's about 2 years behind her. We'll have to have some other talks too about that we didn't have to have with our biological children. It'll be different. So I have a little taste of what's gone on and what's prevalent in our culture with some of the biases and blind spots that are out there. By no means do I understand the full experience that many of you have had. So let me turn now to your story and ask some folks to raise your hand. I hope there's a way to do that here still on Zoom. Or come on the chat window and we'll find a way to get you off mute. But I'd love to hear your story. For anybody, have your own perceptions about race and prejudice changed over time? What experience brought about those shifts? Let me start with that and see if there's anybody brave enough to tell me their story today. See one hand up out there. Kevin Rogers. Thank you. Let's see.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, I got you. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you. First, sir, I wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. That's definitely certainly as a person of color, that's definitely encouraging to hear, and I appreciate your vulnerability with that. My wife and I actually my wife, she's white, and we've been married for almost 30 years now. And yes, as far as kind of some of our, just a little story, through the years, in different places. I'm retired Air Force, and we had the opportunity to travel different places throughout our career, some back on the East Coast, some out here on the West Coast. And through the years, we had different times where, sadly, we've dealt with insensitive comments and just some ignorance. And I think some things that certainly we both, in light of everything that's happening right now, I believe for her and I, it just raised some things that we both felt that we just more or less just kind of pushed back out of our thinking and just accepted it. Well, that's just the way it is. And in this for us through everything that's going on now, it's definitely opened our eyes a bit more, um, to be a little more active. Um, you guys may have seen if you watch any of the news and some of the slogans on the protests that talk about violence being silent, or silence being violence. And I can't say I fully agree with that to an extent, but I know for me, even as a Black American, I realized that I've had some opportunities throughout my life that I've been blessed with, and just realized that it was time to open my mouth and start speaking up. And my wife and I are definitely in agreement there. And we just with her, we have 3 children, 2 biological and 1 adopted, and of course they're all mixed. Even the one that we adopted, he's mixed too as well, Black and white. And um, sir, you talked about having a talk. Certainly, we've, even with my 7-year-old, we've had to already begin conversation just about race relations, and he's trying to understand why people would have such a problem with his skin color, and things like that. Honestly, are heartbreaking. But I believe it's something that I don't harbor bitterness, and I'm thankful. Certainly for the experiences that my wife and I, as weird as it sounds, I'm thankful we've used those as just opportunities to grow. And now we're at a place of maturity where we feel like we can help others. And I know now moving forward, we're encouraged by everything that's going on, even with the protests, as we see, all different walks of life coming together and actually trying to make and instill some change. So yeah, that's basically just kind of a short version of my story.
Thank you, Kevin, for sharing that. Appreciate you being willing to be the
Yes,
first
sir.
here to speak up.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Who else? Okay, Nicole, I see a few more hands here. Let me get to you one at a time. Hold on one second.
Hi, sir. How are you?
Hey, Nicole, go ahead.
I won't share any particular story because I'll be too emotional, but I will just make this comment that even though a person of color, as a Black woman, I may seem that I'm carrying it well day to day, it doesn't mean that it's not heavy. And when I say that, it is challenging when situations like this arise, to have to come into the office and still perform, because I'm still expected to give my 110%, smile, engage, yet in the background, there's tons of things that I'm trying to process and figure out. I'm married to a Black man, 17 years this year, and I have a Black son who'll be 15, and I have a Black daughter who'll be 12. So we've had our fair share of incidents, more so towards my son. So I just ask that people be cognitive that when situations like this arise, whether it's mainstream media or not, that your Black coworkers have to come into work and we still have to perform, and then still go home and dissect everything that we dealt with throughout the day, in addition to all the news and anything of that nature that comes knocking on our doors. So it's a heavy burden to carry. So I just ask people be cognitive to that. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, good point, Nicole. Thank you. I am worried about that when the majority population moves on to the next crisis, and maybe you're part of the other population who still sees there's a lot of work to be done here. It can be tough just to let it go ignored, or to some degree ignored. All right, thank you. John, I'm coming to you next. Okay, John, I think you can go.
Right, how about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I had to click 17 buttons to get my mic unmuted. Sorry. So I'm going to kind of come at this from the other side a little bit. So I was also born in New England, raised in the 60s and 70s. And back then, it was a fairly homogenous state up in New Hampshire at that point. As a matter of fact, I believe probably the first first family, African American family, came in when I was in high school. So it really had no exposure to any other um, lifestyles, life experiences, or wherever other than what we had up in New England. And I think my first experience, and it wasn't a negative experience, it was just, and this was prior, or maybe early high school, or prior to high school, was when affirmative action first started coming out. And I remember my dad sitting at the table. He was a regional manager for National Cash Register, and had two piles of applications on the kitchen table, and just was kind of at a quandary, and I could see it. And he was explaining to me how he had to, not pick from one pile, but pick from another pile. And how does he tell the people on one pile that he can't hire him because he, had to hire from the other pile? So, not that that's a bad thing or a good thing, and I have no comment on that, and I understand the reason for that. But that was really my first experience, and not really understanding of, well, why do you have to do that? Why can't you do that? And then coming in the military, I think, was my first big exposure, basic training to anybody of a whole lot of different races. You're kind of thrown together in a huge melting pot in basic, and that was a fairly eye-opening experience to me. And through 20 years of active duty, and now almost 20 years afterwards, there's good people and there's bad people on both sides. I think what we have to do, and I think every side has to understand, is you try to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, but sometimes you just can't, because you've never walked in those shoes and you don't have that experience. The question that I struggle with, I guess, a lot, and the previous person that was on said, they have to come into work and deal with this, is it's not really comfortable for me to maybe bring up, and I'll happily bring it up and talk about it, but the experiences that are going on right now, if you don't have a huge frame of reference, it's really hard to understand. And maybe understand isn't the right word, but it's hard to, well, I hope everybody understands what I'm trying to say. If you don't have a frame of reference, you haven't experienced what somebody else experiences, has experienced, it's kind of hard to understand, I guess, fully understand.
That's good, John. The point you're bringing up is there's many tentacles of this issue. It's very complicated. It stretches way back over hundreds of years in our nation. We're not going to solve it all today. I do want to focus on what are the practices in our workforce. What's going on? What are the behaviors, the experiences in our workforce that fall into this area of racial prejudice? And let's zero in on that as best we can so we can get after fixing those. I'm going to do just a couple more, and I want to move a little bit on, and then I'll get the other hands that are up. So I'm going to do Michelle, you're next.
Hi, sir. I appreciate you having this forum, and like Nicole, it is very emotional topic and difficult to talk about. There are a lot of layers to it, both publicly and in the workforce. I've experienced racial prejudice growing up as a kid, on both sides, actually, and I won't get into a whole lot of the details, but there are a lot of prejudices, both Black on Black prejudice as well as other prejudice. But I'd like to just kind of get the message out there that prejudice is not an event. And although we tend to express our displeasure with how prejudice presents itself as events, I hope we can eventually understand and get past the point where we look at prejudice as just something that happened to someone. Prejudice is a way of life. It's a thought process. It's a belief system that people have. It's how we treat people on a day-to-day basis or not treat people on a day-to-day basis. It's not just something that you say to someone or a way that you, someone who's being physically attacked. And I think we tend to undermine prejudice by thinking that it's just something that is an attack of someone physically, and it's more than that. And nowadays, it's a lot more done in secret or done in ways that people don't actually get to see or realize. So it's very difficult to pinpoint it or to call it out. It has to do a lot with, for example, in the workplace, if someone of color speaks up in a meeting, you are either disregarded as not knowing the information well, or if you get vocal, then you're demonstrative or you're negative. Maybe you don't get invited to certain meetings that are high visible meetings or get put on the high visible programs. You don't get put in front of senior leadership and given the opportunity to brief or to present your position or even mentored so that you're prepared to do those things. We tend to get put in roles or positions where we are assumed that it will fail. If you get put on a high visible program, maybe you're put on that program because it's not seen that you'd be successful, or if you're not successful, then it's not that important a program anyway. But the high vis programs are the ones that require a lot of nurturing and care. You typically aren't given those programs to work on. So in the workplace, the prejudice is kind of shown a lot more in those regards. We may get hired, but we may not get in the same roles or given the same opportunities. And the thing is, it's not that we want to be given those jobs as a handout. We want to be given fair treatment, and we want to be given the opportunity to prove that we can do the job, but treated the same way as our white counterparts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for saying that in such a controlled way. So I appreciate that input. Okay, I know there's a couple other hands up, at least 3 other hands. I'm going to ask just to hold on. I want to make sure I get a little bit deeper into this, but I'll come back to you, okay? So let me say a few more things here and recommendations, maybe for folks who are having a hard time making sense of what's going on in our country, or just understanding why the strong reaction is so strong and now sustained for weeks across our whole nation. There's lots of different material. We've probably all read and watched different things. I'm going to speak briefly about what moved me, kind of what woke me up. And I'll tell you, I was late. I will admit that I could have done better here. But here's kind of what shook me into doing this today. Good article from a columnist I respect. I read it again last night. And the 2 points he makes that I think are relevant for our discussion. Where you stand depends on where you sit. So for David French, Caucasian, he didn't see a big problem in the nation until he adopted a little girl from Ethiopia. And then he goes over 3 or 4 examples of suddenly he saw it in the way that his daughter was treated in stores and swimming pools, etc. The second thing he points out that I think is really helpful, at least to consider, that it could be true, is he said, if you assume that maybe 10% of Caucasians have some racist behaviors, thoughts, culture they grew up in, let's just say 10%, and that may be the wrong number. Obviously, it's just a number. The majority of the white culture will never see that 10% act that way, because it's white on white. They're not going to see that prejudice come out. But if you're an African American or some other minority, you never know who that 10% are, and you may bump into that 10% in a store, or when you get pulled over by police for a check of some sort, or whatever the circumstance may be. You always have to be on guard. You never know where that 10% may be at. And so your awareness is much more heightened than it is if you're in that majority Caucasian culture. So he does a better job than I just did of trying to explain that, but it helped me as a white guy understand why our nation is reacting so strongly as it is and has been for the last few weeks. Okay, that wasn't very brief. Sorry, I'll be more brief. So number 2, if you haven't watched the 10-minute original video, if you can stomach watching someone killed, and I recognize that that's not always the case. You don't need to see that. Some people do. It's very painful to watch. What got me watching the original 10-minute video is you had an off-duty firefighter, Caucasian lady, who was a concerned citizen, watching the police and saying to the police, check his pulse. He hasn't moved in minutes. Check his pulse. And other folks, other concerned citizens, and just how nonchalant and with total disregard George Floyd is put to death. And imagine if that had been your kid or your friend. It's just unbelievable. General Brown, our incoming chief of staff, his video is a few minutes long about how he lives in two worlds. He puts the uniform on and he's a 4-star general and everybody respects him. All the things that come along with being a 4-star general. He takes the uniform off, and day to day, driving his car, in a store, wherever else, he's now seen totally different. And just that, and his whole career, whether in uniform or out of uniform, what he's seen of this divide in our culture. And then there was a story last week that came up in one of my meetings of a pretty recent incident in our own program office. I won't go into specifics, but it just sounds like a clear case of racial prejudice on an egregious scale of what happened. So that's why I thought we need to do this talk today. We need to connect these concerns to us as airmen, capital A, all of us, civilians and military support contractors alike. We are here, and our adversary wants to do nothing more than to divide us, to have us fight amongst ourselves and argue and be suspicious and put each other down. That would be a great goal for any potential adversary out there, when really it's our diversity, it's our freedom, it's our ability to all live the American dream. The more real that can be, the stronger we are as a nation and as a military. So that's how I tie this in. We've got to stay together and realize our diversity and our differences can be strengths. They are my family, with my wife and my 3 white kids, and then my 2 African-American kids. We're much more diverse. I see how it's helped shape me and develop me and my understanding. And I think it does that for our whole nation when we get it right. So there's a few things I recommend. At the end of the brief, there's some other recommendations that I haven't gone all the way through from EEO, but they're there for you to consider. So let me go to this next area about our climate survey. So I mentioned up front, our DEOC survey, we do once a year roughly. We'll do one later this year when the new commander comes in for LCMC. It may not be towards the end of the year, but I want to do something soon to help get at this for people who aren't willing to speak up in a forum like this. This is all the climate survey asks when it comes to race. It's very little. Discrimination based upon race does not occur in the workplace. And this survey we did back in 2019 and didn't have a great participation rate. You had 2% who strongly disagreed with that statement, indicating there was an issue at least somewhere. And the second question, the only other question in the survey, dealt with racial slurs and comments in the workplace. 8% of those that took the survey said, yeah, that definitely is going on in our workplace. And then there was one free text comment in the survey that kind of spoke about that. So I really need your help here. What are the right questions? If you got something you could put in the chat window for me, doesn't have to be a perfectly worded question. Just what should we be asking our workforce to get at unjust, prejudice, workplace practices, and processes that we have? You can submit it anonymously. You can put your name against it, but I'd really like to have your help with that, so we can send out a better survey to our workforce to get at this issue. Okay, let me pause here and take a couple more comments. So I know, Cindy, you've had your hand up for a while, so I'm going to come to you, and then I think CMR, seeing you raise your hand a few times. You're after Cindy.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Along with kind of some of Kevin's work, I work with Kevin, and I also have a son from an interracial marriage. And just some of the other thoughts other people said too is, just, my son, I hope that in the future I get to see that his generation doesn't see color, because my son doesn't ask me why is his mom white and why is his dad black. And I really hope in the future that we as a society and a nation just don't see color, because I think it's really sad. I think all lives matter, no matter what color you are. All lives matter. So I just wanted to kind of chime that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that. Okay, Dean, I see your hands up. I think CMR's hand must have gone down. So let me come to you next, Dean.
Hey, Zoe.
Hi, sir. I just wanted to relate some of my experiences, both growing up and a couple of instances as an adult. My first best friend was Korean American. We were at each other's houses all the time, and I don't know if that has had an impact on me, but when I was in third grade, we moved to a new town. In this town was 40% Black. And, as I was growing up, I had a number of Black friends. But I saw the racism, both at school and outside of school. But, it wasn't me, and I don't know how I formed the way I did, but I've always, appreciated people of all color. I didn't find out until after I was out of school the level of racism within my own family. I had a cousin who decided to date a Black young man, and my grandfather, my hero, wrote her a letter quoting the Bible on how she should not be dating a Black man. She came to me with this, and I was horrified. And I told her, we're all equal, and if she needed my support within the family to do what she thought was right, she had it. Well, she decided to marry this Black man. And my favorite uncle, her dad, was refusing to go to the wedding because he was a black man. He relented and did go, and they've been married for 15 years or so now. No, more like 20. Anyway, that young man has become one of the pillars of the family, and really opened the eyes of the family that we are all equal. I've been so blessed in my professional life that working with Black people and people of all colors, it's just, I don't see it day in and day out. And so I'm one of those that sometimes I guess gets a little complacent because my world isn't racist, but it is. I just don't see it all the time. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. Okay, let me come to James and CMR, and then I'll come back and get Dee Dee a little bit later on. So James. All right. James, I think you can come off mute now. I'm having a hard time getting James off mute. James, if you can figure it out, we'll come. Oh, you there?
Hi, sir.
Hey, good.
Hey, how are you? Hey, sir. Just want to say there's a lot been said this morning, and I have a lot that I could say, but I'm going to try to be short, of course. You mentioned Birmingham, Alabama, and that's where I grew up, in Birmingham. So I lived through the George Wallace, the Selmas. I used to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to visit my grandparents all the time. That was the scariest time as a kid, going through Selma and crossing that bridge. Then later life, moved to Utah, looking for a house, talking to my realtor, looking around, and I said, what about Kaysville? She looked at me and said, you don't want to move there. You don't want to live there. And I said, I didn't really say anything, but I was like, okay, I'm going to just drive through Kaysville to see why she said that. And lo and behold, the first thing I saw, an individual had their garage open, and along the whole back wall, not a small flag, the whole back wall was a big Confederate flag. And I knew what she meant when she said, you don't want to live there. When I bought my house in Layton, one of the neighbors approached me. I was out looking at the construction workers, and one of the neighbors from the existing home came and asked me, I noticed you come by here quite often. And I just want to know why. I said, well, this is my house, I'm building. And she argued with me that it was my house. So those are just kind of the experiences you go through. The other thing was even on the job, that's the personal. If you want to go to the professional, it was, in meetings that I've been in, I've had individuals look at me in the face and say, James, you know what? That's a good idea. And look at the crowd and they say, you know why we don't implement that idea? Because James came up with it. And why do I know that's not a joke, even though they laughed? Because although it was a good idea, the idea didn't get implemented. So it's things like that. And management looks at it and they probably say, you're not a team member, or you don't have a lot of contributions. Well, first thing, the team has rejected you, and the second is they don't want to hear your contributions. So that impacts your career. For me, I'm not out here for me. I've learned to navigate these waters. I've done pretty well in my life, despite of, not because of. So that's just sort of what I want to throw out there. Another thing you had mentioned was that you just never know, that 10%. So you're always on edge. You just never know. So you always have to be cognizant. I've heard a lot of things from even the people I worked with over the years, even the ones I thought were my friends, even the one I've tried to nurture. And to hear the comments and some of the things, like when our last president was elected, and to see the memes go up and some of the comments, even from the commanders, even from the ones that said, I don't want a black man to sign my retirement papers. And what's that signal? I understand the politics of it, but what from a leadership perspective, what message does that send to the rest of the troop? You don't have to respect a black person. And so there's just a lot to take on. And like one individual said earlier, you have to go to perform. You have to, as a supervisor, you have to rate, but you have to block all of that out when you're rating individuals and know how they think about you. And it's not an easy process. But thanks for listening. That's it.
Thank you, James. It's well said. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. CMR, and I see Indy's got her hand up, and she's helping me today, so I need to get to Indy. CMR, you should be able to talk. Try it out.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so how you doing, sir? And I appreciate everybody with their input. So I'm gonna add just a couple real fast. It won't be taking a long time. But let's go back to, and I'm sorry if I butcher your names and what you were talking about. But first of all, sir, I want to address your situation where you said you have an egregious incident that recently happened. Let me be first to say that egregious to you and egregious to people of color means something totally different. If I say something that's in light or is taken as this lightly, then it's not taken seriously. It's taken oh well, because soft skin, whatever. But if it has to be egregious for something to happen, it has to be, in your words, egregious for somebody to step in, what you don't understand is everything is egregious. When you don't get promoted because of the little things, that's egregious. When you're looked at or you're bypassed or put on a different program, and you know the reason why, or it seems, or the perception is, it's because of your color, it's egregious. Everything's egregious. There is no level of, well, it's not that important. They only said they called you the N-word and not the full word, or they only said this and didn't say that. It's all egregious to a person of color. In addition, I like what John was talking about, walking in somebody's shoes. You know, I don't have a problem talking about anything, but my thing is, just ask me the question. Please don't come and give me your side of it unless you want to hear my side as well, and then take that together and, come up with, a different assumption or a different way to view it. Same thing with words and descriptions. If I'm sitting around and I'm talking or over talking somebody, or anybody of color over talks somebody, then all of a sudden it becomes, you're aggressive, you're agitated, you're angry. However, if I wasn't a person of color, it would be that I'm compassionate. I'm dedicated, I'm motivated to see something change. So the words in and of itself is detrimental to a person of color because it's more of a description, not really the fact that we have, or I have the passion.
Thank you, Chris.
I just listened to. I just listened to about what a lot of people have said about being in meetings. Conversely to James, you can give a good recommendation or something, and it's blown off. But then less than a month later, it's implemented. And it's like, why wasn't it important when I said it? Why wasn't it important when this person said it? And then at the same token, you have people who don't want to get to a glass ceiling. And then you get to a glass ceiling, you're mentored by some of the best, and they get you in a position to, for your career, everybody's career. And then all of a sudden it's stopped, And it's like, so why did you waste all this time mentoring me to let me get to this point?
Thank you, Chris. Sorry about the audio. I'm not sure what was going on there.
No, I think mine is turned up high.
Okay. Indy, why don't you go ahead? Can you go off mute?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. My comment for you was less so to do with what's in the chat, although I will say I think people are definitely getting at some better questions that we can ask on our surveys to help us get to the root of the issue here. I also wanted to take some time and kind of share a little bit of my story because I have experienced racism since before I can remember. My mom is white, my father's black, and we were at a Taco Bell when I was like 3 or 4 years old in Arizona. And me and my cousins were playing in the restaurant, and we ran by this table, and it happened to be a group of skinheads who, long story short, ended up pointing a gun at my mom's head as we were trying to get away from them and leave that Taco Bell because they were being really rude, really mean, and very racist. And that's at 3 or 4 years old experiencing that. And I have a lot of different experiences, a lot of memories and stuff like that. But what my message is, what I would really like to say, and it's kind of to the point of what you got at earlier, was come ready to learn and understand people, and educate yourself, because the words that we use matter. And someone mentioned what might be termed as a microaggression today earlier. And they described it very well of, it's no longer overt, it's no longer something that, someone's using an N-word with a hard ER, it's backhanded comments, that kind of thing, which our terminology today is microaggression for that. So just understand, like, everyone has their own experience, but definitely try to do your research and be open to learning what the words that you're using mean. And, some people might feel like that'll create a restrictive vocabulary for them, but I think it's at least worth understanding the ideology behind the terminology that you're using, because words matter. And when people grow up, they see things for what they are. And, we all try to do our best for our families, for our friends and everything. And I think everyone has good intentions, and being kind can go a long way. But with unintentional, a lot of discrimination and things like that, incidents are, from some people's perspective, unintentional. Like, they never intended to be an evil person, but it's about also taking it by the horns, taking the issue of racism and systemic racism by the horns, and doing your part to end it and create that better future that you see for your families, your friends, your kids, whatever. But that's kind of what I wanted to get at, was our words that we use matter. And, we need to all understand and be understanding of what the path that other people have. So thank you.
Thank you, Indy. Okay. Here's what I'm going to do, given we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to go to the last slide. I'm going to ask for your help, and then I'm going to let Dr. Pleasure talk to us for a second, and we'll wrap it up after that for today. Thank you for the questions in the Q&A. There's 8 so far. That'll help with our future survey. Okay, so we can't do this topic justice in 1 hour. I'd ask you to, sorry about the feedback here. I'd ask you to drop me a note, either anonymously through the feedback that I've got. It's on the note this morning, the Monday morning note. At the bottom of that email is an anonymous feedback link. Answer those questions there. I really appreciate that. Or you can just drop me a note over email directly. I'll hang out here online, and we can talk some more. here. However you'd like to, but I really would like your feedback on these questions. So Dr. Pleasure, let me get you off mute. Okay, give it a shot.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I just wanted to all right, way back when, with the Declaration of Independence, it says specifically all men are created equal. The only thing is, it didn't apply to Black men back then. And it just points to what Michelle had pointed out earlier on. I think it was Michelle, that the racial, I don't know, cultural racial perception maybe has been around for a long time. And I think I've been blessed, and I'm an Air Force brat. I grew up overseas. We left the States when I was 2 and came back when I was 16. And I'm a 62 model. And we left because it was my dad's desire that we be raised away from all the protests and the segregation and everything that was going on in America at that time. So I've been blessed. You know, I did not experience that for the most part. But yeah, I have experienced bigotry for myself. I've experienced it for my mother. And then I've also seen it for my nephew. So it's generational. It keeps on repeating. And so I just wanted to say that where we are today is not where we were. And it's not where we want to be or where we ultimately will be. But I'm just very, very grateful that we're starting down the road to change. And so that said, though, I do want to add one more thing. And this was something that my brother wrote to my nephew. And my nephew is now 24 years old. But he says, and I wanted to share it with you because Colonel Bailey, you were talking about the same thing. All right. He says, I cracked the code to save your life. It's about your hands. The cops need to see your hands. When they pull you over, leave your hands on top of the steering wheel so they can see them while they are still in their car. And as they get out to come alongside to speak to you, don't move. Wait till they tell you to turn down the radio and roll down the windows, glance at the cop, and keep looking through the windshield. Don't ask, why did you pull me over? For this escalates tension. If you are quiet and they can see your hands and you freeze and do not move, they will calm down. Breathe deeply and let the tension calm down. And you will save your life. Pride kills, humility lives. And it's just, you know, that a parent has to teach their child that. I'm praying that this is ending. And that's the steps we're on. I'm done.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Here's some other next steps for our workplace here. The last slide I've got for you today. So please help me get a better survey out. I think the typical climate surveys aren't specific enough. Thank you for the questions so far. They come in the Q&A box. You can put them there. You can put them in the chat window. You can send them to me anonymously over my feedback, or just email them to me. I want to take your inputs and the results of the survey and meet with all the supervisors across the SPO and go over what we've heard and what we've learned, discuss next steps from there. I saw some comments about we need to do this in a smaller group. I agree. So I anticipate we're going to see, smaller group discussions, talk about how there's no room for bystanders here. If you see racial prejudice happening in our workplace, on the road, in the office, on video calls, we all have an obligation to call it out and to get it to stop. I think there's some work to be done on mentoring and on supervisor-employee alignment. I've got, by no means am I the person who should be developing all the answers. I'm the wrong person to do that. Help me. What else can we do to root this problem out of our workforce? Okay, I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes. Thank you again for how professionally you handled this topic today, for bearing with me and my shortcomings, trying to cover it and do it justice. It's much appreciated. And I'll hang out here for a few minutes to see if there's any other comments. But that's going to be it for the whole forum overall. Thank you very much.
Hey, Colonel Bailey.
Yeah, go ahead, Indy.
Hey, sir. So I was briefly kicked off of the call and almost immediately rebooted, but I do think that we addressed all of the comments, or most of the comments, and some people are putting like suggestions and everything, which are great. And I just wanted to give you that feedback of, first, thank you for sharing your story, and second, I think that we effectively addressed people's comments.
Okay. Thank you, Indy, for helping out.
Yes, sir.
So I'm going to record all the questions and answers that came in the chat window. The video should be recorded. We'll go back through to make sure. Kevin, I see your hands up. I think you're off mute. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I did have a question as far as, now I know the base, I've seen at different times, as far as a cultural committee or multicultural committee. I'm not quite sure. Of course, I'm a contractor there on base in the unit, but I'm not sure what's even available for, well, I would say definitely for contractors and civilians alike, if that's open to it, or if it's only for government employees and military. I would hope to see maybe more of a more inclusive, since we are speaking of inclusion as well, of everyone, especially if you're there on base. Folks like myself, I know I want to see what can be done and what I can do to help in this.
Excellent point, Kevin. Let me do some homework on that. I can't imagine why it would be limited to only government, civilians, or military. So, but let me go double check.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, how about Chris and Cindy?
Can you hear me, sir? Okay, so I was just going to add one more thing. Just you know, I'm very committed to this organization and the things that you're doing, and our leadership team is trying to do. I just ask, as we go forward, as you start looking at ways to address cultural and and ethnic differences and what to do to help the organization, that you do involve people of color on that team. It's just as well as people can't walk in our shoes and don't understand our perspectives or why we think a certain way. You got to have those people in the room so collectively we can have that discussion and gain that understanding going forward. Because if you're not part of the culture and you make a recommendation, you may miss the point. And it would seem so with a lot of all these things going on, that many organizations, states, city, government leaders have missed the point. So I just asked, as we go forward, for this organization, bringing that team together to talk about our diversity and how we're going to, correct some of these things, that we do have people of color in that discussion as well.
Absolutely. Yep, 100% agree. If it's just me or people who look like me, we've got a very small chance of getting it right. So thank you, Chris. Okay, Cindy.
Hi, sir. Sorry for getting emotional earlier.
It's okay.
I hope my message was maybe not emotional earlier, so my apologies. And I just wanted to say, I hope we continue to work these types of forums, because I think that they help get a better understanding and awareness of what's going on within our organization and how we. That's it. Thank you.
No, thank you, Cindy. Sorry for the feedback. We'll find a better way next time. Thank you for your inputs. Okay, anybody else have any other comments to make before we wrap it up today? Okay. Okay, good. Everything's going to be recorded, so we can go back through it and see what maybe came in on the chat window or the Q&A window that I missed. And if you hear of other folks who were part of today's talk or who wanted to be but couldn't make it, we'll find a way to get the link to them because we did record the video as well. That's it for now. Thanks so much, everybody out here.